To the esteemed judges and to everyone present today, good morning. Today I will be presenting my paper, The Past and Future of Japan and the Philippines, Foundations for Strengthened Ties in a Multipolar World. This paper, in the course of reviewing events in both Japanese and Philippine history, proposes the existence of three main historical affinities between Japan and the Philippines. Considering these parallels, alongside evidence of a long-running, though interrupted, exchange of material culture, as well as contemporary geopolitical realities, this paper then proposes a broad program of diplomatic cooperation and economic interchange. Before the Spanish Colonial Period, the Philippine archipelago formed the outer edges of an established trade circle, which extended from the Persian Gulf to southern China. The pre-colonial Southeast Asian polities acted as transshipment centers and as sources of raw materials, and harbored ships from as far north as the Ryukyu Islands of Japan. Considering the interconnectedness of trade in this period, Japan and the Philippine chiefdoms must have exchanged goods, whether directly or indirectly. We need not rely on conjecture to reach that conclusion. The Tokiko, an 1854 treatise by Tanaka Yonesaburo, describes the pottery of the Naban Islands, a generic term for various places in Southeast Asia and India, including Luzon or Luzon. Luzon pottery was marked by the national writing of Luzon, Luzono Kukuji, known in Filipino as Baybayin. A small but important moment of exchange occurred in the mid to late 1500s, when Toyotomi Hideyoshi, the second great unifier of Japan, dispatched a ship to Luzon and had a jar made in the Furo-ori Enshu style. Yonesaburo describes a picture which experts took for Enshu ware, but which he identified as a Namban production. The fact that experts could mistake Namban ware for Enshu, combined with the report of Hideyoshi's dispatch, suggests a long-running exchange of pottery between Japan and Luzon. However, the exchange of ideas, if not of goods, would come to an end soon after Hideyoshi's dispatch. In 1597, Hideyoshi ordered the arrest and execution of 26 Christian priests. Three of the so-called 26 martyrs came to Japan through the Philippines, and it is likely that the Spanish colonization of the islands, the construction of a base from which the Spanish could spread Christianity, influenced Hideyoshi's thinking. His successor, the shogun Ieyasu Tokugawa, proceeded to close off Japan to the rest of the world. Thus, throughout most of the Spanish colonial period of Philippine history, the Philippines had little cultural contact, much less diplomatic relations with Japan. It was only in the late 18th century, near the end of Spanish rule in the Philippines, when a connection was reestablished between Japan and the Philippines, owing to the end of the former's isolationist policy. As it turned out, both the fall of Spanish rule in the Philippines and the end of Japanese isolationism had much to do with a rising imperial power, the United States of America. In 1853, U.S. President Millard Fillmore dispatched Navy Commodore Matthew C. Perry to Japan with 4 small warships to convince the Japanese to open their ports for trade. Perry's squadron left Japan after less than 10 days, but his fleet, now comprising 6 ships with more than 100 cannon, reappeared in the Bay of Edo on February 11, 1854. His self-presentation as a character of unreasonable obstinacy and his deliberate displays of power ultimately forced the Japanese to sign the Treaty of Kanagawa on March 31, 1854. The treaty's provisions were favorable to the Americans. Article 2 allowed American ships to refuel and provision themselves at the ports of Shimoda and Hakodate. Article 11 gave American consuls permission to reside in Shimoda, and Article 9 stipulated that any privilege granted to a non-US nation shall be granted likewise to the United States, without any consultation or delay. However, the treaty did not permit Americans to trade in Japan. That would come with the 1858 Treaty of Amity and Commerce, which opened Shimoda, Hakodate, and 4 other ports to trade, granted US citizens the right to permanently reside, lease ground, and erect buildings in those ports, and made foreign residents subject to their own country's laws rather than Japanese law, among others. We can compare the arrangement imposed on Japan to that undergone by the Philippines during the American occupation of the islands. After the Philippine-American War, the U.S. Congress passed the Organic Act of the Philippine Islands, which advanced the operation of U.S. business and investment interests in the islands. For instance, Section 21 of the Act opened mineral deposits in public lands to exploration, occupation, and purchase by citizens of the United States, in addition to those of the islands. Sections 41 and 42 clarify U.S. citizens' equal right to claim building stone and petroleum deposits, and Section 53 defines a similar right to claim coal lands. A later law, the Tidings-McDuffie Act of 1934, instituted free trade between the Philippines and the US, though the trade was free in only one direction, as certain Philippine exports to the US were restricted. A year later, the 1935 Constitution of the Philippine Commonwealth accorded US citizens and corporations the same property rights as Filipinos. Here, 3 main differences between the Japanese and Philippine experiences must be noted. First, while the US relied on threats and minor shows of military force in Japan, they employed it to its fullest extent in the Philippines. Second, while the US presence in Japan after the signing of the 1858 Treaty of Amity and Commerce was limited to consulates and business enclaves, the US actually occupied most of the Philippines, allowing American strategic and business interests to dominate the islands. And third, the direct exploitation of natural resources was only sanctioned in the Philippines. However, the imposition of unequal trade agreements between the US and another country, backed by the threat or use of US military force, and resulting in American preeminence in the other country's international trade, constitutes the first historical affinity between Japan and the Philippines. A second historical affinity is the experience of discrimination and repression in the US, an obstacle faced by both Japanese and Filipino immigrants. From 1900 to 1945, 100,000 Japanese nationals arrived in the United States. Initially, these migrants worked in farms, mines, canneries, and railroad construction in the American West, but many eventually launched their own businesses, starting their own farms and produce shops. By 1920, Japanese immigrant farmers controlled more than 450,000 acres of land in California. This relative success bred resentment, and throughout the early 20th century, sensational news stories portrayed the Japanese as a threat to American labor, as well as a menace to American women and as a corrupting force in American society. As the United States was drawn into the Second World War, the prevalence of anti-Japanese sentiment led to the widespread acceptance of the large-scale internment of people of Japanese descent in the US mainland. Filipinos had a similar experience of racial exclusion in America. Like the early Japanese migrants, the Filipino migrants of the early 1900s initially provided a supply of cheap labor for American farms in Hawaii and the West Coast. By 1926, about 150,000 Filipinos lived and worked in the United States. Owing to the fact that as US nationals, their immigration to the States was less restricted by the 1924 Immigration Act. While their in-between status as nationals granted them rights to enter the country and look for work, Filipinos in the US were unable to vote, own land, or marry white women. Anti-miscegenation laws in the West Coast, an expression of the American eugenics movement of the early 20th century, classified Filipinos as Mongolians to prevent them from marrying into the privileges of whiteness. Those who ventured out of Filipino enclaves become targets of harassment and physical abuse. One final part of the historical parallel, while not an example of discrimination, is the fact that the American use of internment camps has its origins in reconcentration, a tactic which the US first employed in its war with the Philippines. Again, differences between the Japanese and Philippine experiences must be acknowledged. First, Filipinos were essentially citizens, if second-class ones, of the US, which protected them from anti-Asian immigration bans, if nothing else. Second, the internment of the Japanese Americans took place in the context of the Second World War, in which Japan was an enemy nation, while Filipinos likely gained some prestige in the US as an ally of theirs in the Pacific theater. Nevertheless, this shared familiarity with American discrimination, of hostility from labor and exclusion from mainstream life, serves as the second historical affinity between Japan and the Philippines. A third and final historical affinity is the continuance of US involvement in both countries' domestic affairs after the Second World War, especially in the realms of defense and economics. With the Cold War on the horizon, the US considered it imperative to maintain a military presence in East and Southeast Asia. Pursuant to this goal, on March 14, 1947, the US and the Philippines signed the Military Bases Agreement, which extended the existing 50-year lease on US bases in the Philippines to 99 years. The agreement gave the US control over 23 bases, 16 of which were in active use at the time. A corollary document, the Military Assistance Agreement of March 21, 1947, banned the Philippines from accepting outside military aid or advisors from elsewhere without America's permission. In the early 1990s, the US gradually withdrew from its Philippine bases, but this did not end the US military presence in the Philippines. In 1999, the US and the Philippines signed the Visiting Forces Agreement, which allows American troops, vessels, and aircraft to enter the country, as well as placing US personnel in the jurisdiction of American military authorities rather than Philippine courts. Meanwhile, having fought in the Second World War as an Axis power, Japan was occupied by the Supreme Command of Allied Powers, or SCAP, after its surrender in August of 1945. The SCAP proceeded to impose political, military, and economic reforms on Japan, with the objectives of disarming Japan, punishing it for its acts of aggression, and reviving its shattered economy. In military terms, this meant the disbanding of the Japanese armed forces. As the Cold War approached, however, the US went through a reverse course regarding Japan, which, like the Philippines, came to be seen as essential to the containment of communism. The US and Japan signed a bilateral security treaty in September of 1951, which allowed the US to maintain armed forces in and about Japan. In 1960, the agreement was revised to grant the US the right to build bases on Japanese soil. As such, as of 2021, the US maintains at least 86 bases on the archipelago, including 31 on Okinawa alone. Proceeding to the realm of economics, the release of the Philippines from US official dominion in 1946 marked the transition from a colony into a neocolony. The Philippine Trade Act, or PTA, of 1946 provided for an 8-year period of free trade, followed by 20 years of gradually increasing tariffs. The PTA also placed quotas on certain Philippine exports to the US, but fixed no quota on US goods entering the Philippines. Most controversial, however, was the Parity Amendment, Article 7 of the PTA, under which the disposition, exploitation, development, and utilization of the natural resources of the United States shall, quote, if open to any person, be open to citizens of the United States and to US-owned commercial enterprises. By 1976, the parity provisions had produced the desired effects. The assets of American corporations comprised an estimated 80% of total foreign investments in the Philippines. 24 of the 50 biggest businesses in the Philippines were US-owned. In Japan, meanwhile, the US occupation's policy was initially oriented towards restricting the tempo of recovery prior to 1948. However, as the Cold War continued, US officials worried about Japan's creeping neutralism. Fearful of losing their primary foothold in Asia, the US found an ally, the staunchly anti-communist Kishida. Beckley et al. Lists three main economic initiatives which accompanied security treaty negotiations in 1958: a series of low-interest loans to Japan, a reduction in Japan's defense spending, which freed up resources for use in expanding the private sector, and the promotion of Japanese exports, which increased American purchases from Japan by over 115% in the 2 years succeeding the negotiations. As always, divergences between the Philippine and Japanese experiences must be acknowledged. First, the US enacted reforms in Japan in the context of its status as a former enemy nation, predisposing those reforms towards disruption of the former order, whereas US actions in the Philippines were geared towards maintaining the pre-war arrangement, creating nothing other than a neo-colonial dependence. Second, and consequently, the economic reforms in Japan were beneficial to the country's development. From 1958 to 1968, Japan's GDP grew by an average of 9.3% per year, thrice as fast as the synthetic Japan, in which reforms did not take place, while the Philippine post-war arrangement retarded the development of Filipino enterprise, especially in natural resource extraction. However, the purpose of the post-war arrangements, constructing a barrier against the expansion of communism, was the same in both the Philippines and Japan. The continued US military presence in both countries, as well as the enactment of exclusive agreements which advance US strategic and economic interests abroad, serves as the second historical affinity between Japan and the Philippines. In 1991, as the Soviet Union dissolved, the United States emerged as the world's only superpower, marking the beginning of the unipolar era. As Nye points out, the terms unipolar and multipolar are cliched oversimplifications. The complexity represented by the rise of other countries and the increased role of non-state actors demands more nuanced language. However, the period from 2015 to 2021 has seen declines in US diplomatic influence and economic power, as well as strategic advances by China, Russia, and other powers. On the diplomatic front, the Trump administration's America First foreign policy has alienated much of the developed world and demonstrated to nations which distrust the US that a stable, peaceful arrangement is unlikely. In economic terms, the US fell from being the world's most competitive economy in 2018 to being the 10th most competitive in 2020. In early 2021, analysts predicted that China would surpass the US as the world's largest economy before 2030. Finally, while the US maintains the largest armed force in the world, spending $730 billion on its military in 2019, actions by both China and Russia, such as China's construction of airstrips in the South China Sea and Russia's incursions into the resource-rich, strategically crucial Arctic Circle, have threatened America's dominance in both regions. As such, accepting the term for simplicity's sake, a multipolar era has begun, in which, with apologies to Nye, the US will have, quote, slightly less relative power in the midst of a much more complex world, end quote. Regardless, the US military presence in the South China Sea has increased in the past half-decade. The South China Sea Strategic Situation Probing Initiative reported in 2020 that the scale, number, and duration of the US military activities in the region was rarely seen in recent years. China's territorial claims in the South China Sea, rejected in 2016 by the Permanent Court of Arbitration at The Hague, are nonetheless being defended. The Southern Theater Command of the Chinese Armed Forces, which covers the South China Sea, has the biggest share of China's naval vessels, including all 4 of its nuclear-armed submarines. According to a 2020 article by O.S. Mastro, the U.S. has a strong interest in preventing China from asserting control over the South China Sea in order to maintain free access to the vital waterway. In addition, China's construction of artificial islands with military installations has made it a focus of tension with the United States, owing to its defense treaty obligations to the Philippines. A U.S. or Philippine-Chinese armed conflict, even one in which the fighting is confined to the disputed areas, would cause a cessation of maritime trade for 9 countries, including the Philippines, which would reduce the country's GDP by 7.8 to 17.4%. Japan, meanwhile, would see a GDP reduction of 1.7 to 3.5%. In a widespread armed conflict between the US and China or North Korea, however improbable one may be, US bases in Japan and the Philippines would be magnets for enemy attacks, including nuclear attacks, which could result in heavy civilian casualties if, like the bases on Okinawa, they are in or near population centers. Reducing the probability of armed conflict, whether in the South China Sea or over the Sea of Japan, is therefore in the interest of every country in the Asia-Pacific region and around the world. This paper submits that Japan and the Philippines' shared experience of exploitation by, discrimination in, and dependence on the United States could serve as a foundation for new channels of cooperation, especially in order to prevent armed conflict in maritime East and Southeast Asia. Chiefly, this paper proposes that Japan and the Philippines, along with other countries which would be threatened by armed conflict, work together to pressure the US into reducing, if not ceasing, military operations or activities in the region which could provoke China, North Korea, or other US adversaries. The Japanese and Filipino immigrant populations could exert even more direct pressure on US elected officials. Considering the decline of US diplomatic cachet, the Biden administration may respond favorably. As for the Japanese government, Prime Minister Kishida's record suggests that his administration is amenable to working with the Philippines on de-escalation. As a leader of the Kochikai faction, his diplomatic philosophy aligns with the Kochikai tradition of humane, pacifistic diplomacy. In particular, Kishida has stated that in the event of an emergency involving Taiwan, Japan would only take actions, quote, in line with the law, in reference to the pacifist Japanese constitution, which Kishida is lukewarm about revising. Overall, his approach of balancing the Sino-Japanese relationship and the Japan-US alliance will likely ease cooperation with the Philippines and other countries on a push for de-escalation in the Western Pacific. The prognosis on the Philippine government is less certain, but the signs are encouraging. The presidential frontrunner, Ferdinand Bongbong Marcos Jr., has ruled out war against China over its incursions in the South China Sea, while incumbent Vice President Leni Robredo, a distant second to Marcos, falling 33 percentage points behind him as of December 2021, has expressed her intent to cooperate with China in non-conflict areas such as trade and investment. In economic terms, the differential effects of US-led initiatives in the Philippines and Japan could spur the already existing cooperation in industrial development, with Japanese experts advising Filipino manufacturing and resource processing businesses. And that's my paper. Thank you for watching.